10 years ago, when the city of Luoyang was conquered, the Su family, which had enjoyed 100 years of prestige and fame, collapsed overnight. The males were killed, buried beyond the walls of Luoyang, while the females hung themselves within the Su family manor. Su Bai. This was a name everyone in Great Yue was familiar with. Not because Su Bai was extraordinarily gifted or talented, but because she was the only living descendant of the legendary Su family. The only survivor of this bloodshed was the young daughter, Su Bai, who vanished without a trace. For over 10 years, the devoted subordinates of the Su family searched high and low for this young girl. Even now, the walls of Luoyang continue to be plastered with her posters. With the entire affair causing a storm throughout the city, today, no one within Great Yue was unfamiliar with the name Su Bai. 10 years later, in an indifferent voice, this woman who suddenly appeared before me told me her name was Su Bai. As an ordinary, unremarkable little civilian, the instant I heard her name, I was stunned and choked on my sweet potato. She looked at the shock written all over my face and laughed soundlessly. Before she continued, "Back then, I went to Southern Zhao, so I never knew that they were looking for me. Later, when I finally knew, it was too late for me to return." She could no longer return, because in Southern Zhao, she fell in love with a man. That man was the person who rescued her 12-year-old self from the ruins of the fallen city of Luoyang before bringing her to Southern Zhao. He was the Gu master of Southern Zhao, a man whose existence was as revered upon as a deity's, Yue. Perhaps anyone who heard his name would imagine that such a name could only belong to an exceedingly callous, selfish, and demonic man. But to Su Bai, he was not such a person. He taught her the art of mastering the gu, a poison carried by venomous insects. He taught her how to be strong. When she was ill, he brewed medicine for her. When she cried, he wiped away her tears. Once he had said to the 12-year-old Su Bai, "Su Bai, I will give you a home." And so Su Bai believed with all her heart that he would give her a home. And then she followed him with devotion, and in the days that passed, as the weeks melded into months and the months turned into years, she fell in love with him. I have always looked up to him. Su Bai stared unseeingly at the bonfire as she continued. "Every day, without fail, I studied all there was to know about the different venomous insects and memorized all the techniques in preparing a gu poison. When others retired for the night, I continued to read my books by the lamplight. When others woke up the next morning, I had long climbed the mountains in search of the venomous insects." She even asked the others about the likes and dislikes of Yue, carefully observing his habits. She knew that he disliked it when others prevaricated and said, "Because that's why I." So she never explained nor excused herself each time she made a mistake. She knew that he did not like excessive noise, so she never wore any jewelry nor adorned herself with ornaments. She knew that he did not like dust and dirt in his room, so each time before she visited him, she would first bathe and change her clothes before stepping barefoot into his palace. 10 years of conscientiousness and carefulness. In the end, he said to her, "Su Bai, you are distracted by unnecessary thoughts. Someone who has such thoughts will never be able to become a good gu master." Later, he accepted another disciple. Her name was Lai. She was the princess of Southern Zhao and was gifted with a fine voice. Do you know, every time she sang, Master would smile. His smile was so warm, but he had never smiled towards me. I tried so hard, risking my life time after time to create the perfect gu poison to make him happy. Yet she did not have to do anything, other than sing some songs and gather some flowers, and she could already make him laugh. As Su Bai recalled the past, her eyes began to water. I remained silent without a word, and could only pretend to be unperturbed by continuing to weave my red thread of destiny. Su Bai raised a sleeve to wipe away her tears, looking like a young child who had suffered a grievance, before she continued, "Later, Master told me he no longer had any use for me. He wanted me to continue my own training to become a good gu master." That night, it had been snowing. The moon hung high in the skies, its glow incandescent in the endless sea of darkness. She had knelt in front of his room, crying as she pleaded with him. Yet that man remained coolly distant, as if she were a mere ghost. She cried until her voice became hoarse, until at last it was Lai who came and helped her up from the ground. Alai said to her, "Su Bai, do you know, a person only exists because he is of use. As long as you are useful to Southern Zhao, Master will never abandon you." A pause. Then Alai continued, "Su Bai, join the war and become someone of use. Southern Zhao will become your country. We will be your home." "And then you came?" I was surprised. Su Bai did not answer. After a long moment, she nodded, lifting her head to stare at the stars which twinkled in the night skies. Sometimes a person's stubbornness will become a vice. Each time a battle ended, I would be tormented by the nightmares. But each time I brought the latest military reports to his palace and saw him, I would feel that it was all worth it. But I never knew exactly how long I could persevere. She raised a hand to her heart and slowly said, "I did not even dare to use my name. Whenever I saw the word Su, it was as though I was heading on the path towards destruction, slipping beyond the reach of redemption. Each time I saw him smile towards Alai, the despair in my heart drove me to insanity." "Then, what dream do you wish for?" I raised the red thread woven between my fingers. "I have already used the memories you've described to me to weave a dream for you. After you die, I will draw you into this illusion. What do you wish to do within this dream?" "I wish to see him." She smiled faintly and covered her eyes with her hands. Finally, I saw the large drops of tears sliding down the curve of her face. "And then be with him forever." That was her dream. I promised her, and when dawn broke the next morning, she had already left together with my last sweet potato. Following that, I returned to the military camps of Great Yue in dejection, kneeling before my master's rooms as I cried while admitting to my mistakes. My master did not harden his heart to expel me. After his anger subsided, he once again brought me to the battlefield, where he continued to impart his teachings towards me. Back then, the main armies of Great Yue and Southern Zhao were fighting at close range, making it difficult to distinguish between the two forces. I stood at the top of the city tower and saw with astonishment a great white python amongst the vanguard of the enemy's troops. Standing atop the head of the python was a young woman dressed in black robes, her hair flying in the wind. With a jerk of her slender wrists, countless goo insects scurried forth from her sleeves as they scattered in the direction of the troops of Great Yue. I did not have a clear look at the woman, only I saw the soldiers swarm towards her like a great wave of angry seas. Yet the army of Southern Zhao, which stood behind her, did not move an inch, watching coldly as the crowd of soldiers from Great Yue slowly smothered her. Following that, I saw the young general who stood next to me abruptly draw back his bow as he bellowed, "Su Bai!" That young woman raised her head, and it was in that split second of hesitation when a rain of arrows pierced through the bloody skies to penetrate her shoulders. The young general laughed, his voice jarring. I turned to look at him, only to see that he had laughed until tears had fallen from his eyes. He stood at the top of the city tower, his voice demanding as he said, "Su Bai, how can you face your entire family of fallen soldiers, a family with 100 years of loyalty to Great Yue? Su Bai, do you know? Beyond the city of Luoyang, where the bones of your father and brothers were buried, the flowers which have blossomed has already reached our waist level." Even as he said these words, countless goo insects were already swarming towards him. Eventually, that young general could not endure against the excruciating pain. With a leap, he jumped off the top of the city tower. My master hurriedly pulled me towards the back, protecting me from the chaos. From my narrow cracks of vision, I saw Su Bai expertly navigate her python as she anxiously made her way towards the base of the city tower, before she carried the body of the young general into her arms. I did not know what the young general said to her. I only saw Su Bai use her sleeves to wipe away the fresh blood which spilled from his mouth over and over again, her sorrowful cries piercing through the bloody battlefield. I had never seen a person cry in such devastation before. Even till today, I am unable to forget this image of her grief. My master quickly observed that I was in a state of shock and hurriedly dragged me away from the city tower. It was in that war-torn battlefield that she hugged that man, crying her heart out. Much later, from the whispers which spread, I learned that though she had been gravely wounded, she nonetheless managed to slaughter her way out of the encirclement, together with her python. At that time, The soldiers who intercepted her did not only include the troops of Great Yue, for the soldiers of southern Zhao had also turned their bows towards her as they released arrow after unrelenting arrow in her direction. In the end, with a body covered with injuries, she disappeared without a trace, shaking off her pursuers. 1 year later, I finally finished my tutelage and became a Master of Destiny, where I started to fulfill my responsibilities according to my pact with my master. I was surrounded by a sea of people, coming forth to me with endless requests, yet I never managed to find her. So, even though I continued accepting the businesses from others, I started traveling south until 3 years later, I finally arrived at southern Zhao, the way I had promised that person. Indeed, my trip had not been in vain. I had only arrived for 3 days when I met Yue Qi. I sat before the desk and slowly recounted to Yue Qi my only meeting with Su Bai. Yue Qi sat facing me, his expression as stoic as a still lake. Only when he heard me describe her sorrowful cries at the base of the city tower did he suddenly recoil. Later, I said to him, "I once wove a dream for her. If you really wish to find her, I can bestow you her dream. I will transform it into her past, and we can search for her from the memories. Perhaps we will be able to find her then." "What do you want?" He lifted his head and asked. I thought for a moment, and as there was nothing I wanted, I only asked him, "Did you ever love her?" His eyes cast downwards, shielding the emotions within his gaze. A long moment passed before he finally answered, "From when she vanished 3 years ago, I have been searching for her. Alai told me that she fled because she did not wish to obey my orders, and that she hated me, to the extent that she would rather die than to see me once again. Except," he paused. His voice remained emotionless, yet it now carried a trace of surety, "I do not believe." "What basis do you have to not believe?" Without reason, I was struck with anger by his confidence and could not help but continue in a huff. "If my master were a man like you, I would definitely run as far as I can and choose death over you. You are different from her." Hearing my words, the corners of his mouth lifted in a faint smile. "In my world, she is the only person who exists. I watched her grow up, and I have done so for over 10 years. In this world, there is no other person who better understands her than myself. She loves me. Even if she died, she would also choose to die by my side." He spoke without a hint of uncertainty. Fuming, I gritted my teeth, silently indignant for Su Bai. But I endured it, only rolling my eyes as I said, "Tonight, we enter her dream." "All right." He nodded without hesitation. That night, I made the arrangements and then asked Yue Qi to bring that woman who accompanied him, his most powerful gu, Chui Sha, to keep guard outside the door. Following that, I made him lie down and wove a red thread around his entire body before twining the other end of the thread around myself. Later, the both of us slept on a bamboo couch and closed our eyes. Not long after, I saw a bright light ahead and walked towards it, only to see that Yue Qi had long been standing there awaiting my arrival. As I neared him, the place dissolved into a battlefield, and I was immediately besieged with the battle cries of soldiers and the furious whines of war horses from all directions. Frightened, I shivered and hurriedly asked Yue Qi, "Where is this?" Yue Qi did not speak, his gaze intent upon a distance. I followed his gaze and looked over, only to see Su Bai. That was the last day I had seen her, at the base of the city tower, crying as she hugged the body of the young general. Her sobs were unrelenting, and silently, Yue Qi and I drew near. Within this dream, the both of us were like spirits. Others could not see us, and we could not touch them. Yue Qi and I stood next to the two of them, and we soon heard the young general say to Su Bai, "Young Lady Su, all along, we've been searching for you. That conniving prime minister hated General Su, wanted to kill you. But the remaining generals of the Su family in this battle, all were killed." Su Bai stood there, stupefied. In that instant, a rush of arrows pierced through the skies, and Su Bai violently reacted, swiftly releasing the venomous goo insects from her hands, allowing them to block the onslaught of arrows. Holding the young general's body tight within her arms, she rolled across the grounds before leaping onto the back of her massive snake, rapidly navigating the snake across the field as they fled. The speed with which she accomplished all these was immensely quick, and if it were not for Yue Qi, who held onto me in a dead grip as we chased after her, she would have long disappeared into the crowd right before our very eyes. She fled without pausing the entire way, and finally managed to evade the pursuing troops at the hilltop. As she panted for breath, not even a moment had passed when a couple of horse riders suddenly appeared from the sides. The newcomers were all dressed in clothes of southern Zhao. Su Bai looked at them before she asked furiously in between her rapid breathing, "Why did you not come to my aid earlier?" "The battle is about to be over," was the incomprehensible reply from the other party. Su Bai froze just as she heard him continue, "Will a Han person like you really help southern Zhao? Princess Alai has already told us you only wish to seduce the Gu master so that you can completely annihilate southern Zhao in the future." His words having fallen, he took out his knife, slowly walking towards her. Yet Su Bai smiled. Her smile was faint, even as her fingers tightened around the young general's ice-cold body, knuckles whitening. "So this is what you actually think?" She began to laugh. "I risked my life for southern Zhao, killed my countrymen for southern Zhao, but in the end, this is what you truly think of me?" Finally, she released the Gu insects from within her sleeves and used her great python to open a path for them, swiftly fighting her way out of the encirclement. A sleet of arrows rained in her direction, and her exposed back was a marked target pierced with arrows. Even as she violently spat out a mouthful of blood, her grip on the snake's body remained unrelenting, while her other arm tightened around a corpse. Pressing her face close towards that dead person, she said, "Susan, I don't believe what you've said. Susan, even if I can never return to Great Yue, even if the common folk of southern Zhao believe me to be a spy, I still have a home. Susan, my master once said to me, he will give me a home. I believe him." As she said these words, her tears began to land on Susan's ashen face, mingling with the blood on his cheeks as they slid down his face. I could not help but glance at Yue Qi, who stood by my side. I asked him, "What were you doing then?" He did not reply, only dragging me along as we followed closely behind Su Bai. The moon which hung in the sky was bright, its glow illuminating the grounds, allowing me to see with clarity Yue Qi's eyes, which remained as lifeless as the stagnant waters of an abandoned well, devoid of a hint of emotion. Without rest or sleep, Su Bai ran for 3 days. 3 days later, she buried Susan's body in a place blooming with camellia, before she returned to southern Zhao, secretly trespassing the palace of the Gu master. She had only just entered when she saw Alai, who had been keeping watch there. Alai remained smiling, as she often was. She was dressed beautifully in embroidered robes and wore jewelry which jingled as she moved gracefully. She clapped her hands, then exclaimed, "Ah, Su Bai, you finally returned?" Wordlessly, Su Bai stared at her eyes as sharp as a hawk's. Yet I saw that her hands trembled, as though she was forcibly suppressing something. Slowly, she asked Alai, "Why? What? Why?" Alai's face was a picture of innocence. Su Bai continued, "I will never rebel against southern Zhao. You know this. I do not." Alai's expression abruptly cooled. With great derision, she said, "I have never trusted you Han people, who are as crafty as you are cunning. Especially you, Su Bai, descendant of the Su family, a family who has never in 100 years produced a traitor towards Great Yue. I am not the only person. No one in southern Zhao will believe in you. Even if it were Lord Yue Qi, it will be the same. You wish to seduce Lord Yue Qi. Of course, we will beat you at your own game and use you in return. From the very beginning, we're all the same kind of people, our hands stained with blood of the innocent. Why do you pretend to be otherwise?" Alai lifted her head arrogantly, her eyes filled with contempt. "Do you really believe Lord Yue Qi loves you? Since you fled from the battlefield, how dare you return today? Let me tell you this, Lord Yue Qi is about to give you away. Give me to someone else." Su Bai paled as she said through trembling lips, "I don't believe. Master will never." "Do you still remember your father's archenemy, that conniving prime minister of Great Yue?" Alai walked down the steps and drew closer to her. Smiling, she continued, "He has an extremely powerful Gu. With it, Lord Yue Qi will be able to create the Jue Sha Gu, the dream Gu all Gu masters wish to create. That prime minister is willing to exchange you for it, and Lord Yue Qi has acceded to his request." I don't believe, Su Bai repeated over and over before she suddenly shouted, "Master promised me he would give me a home. He would never lie to me. Alai did not reply, her smile complacent. After a long moment, she slowly said, "If you don't believe me, why don't you ask him that for yourself?" Alai left. I saw the ghastly white face of Yue, who stood next to me, his body trembling. I had a premonition that something terrible was about to happen, and sure enough, I saw a dispirited Su Bai slowly make her way towards Yue's room before she knelt on the grounds outside the door. Her body was still injured from her wounds, but when she knelt, her back remained completely straight, her posture unyielding. The fine rain in the autumn skies of southern Zhao fell steadily on her back, blood-red flowers blossoming across the grounds as her blood melded with the rainwater which stretched across the compound. She knelt for a long time, so long that I thought she would perhaps kneel in this manner for all of eternity, when she finally opened her mouth and called the man within the room, "Master!" It was already nightfall. That man's shadow was reflected in the window panes of his room, and she knelt there, her head raised, her eyes unswerving from his reflection. The person within the room did not open the door, continuing to read his book even as he addressed her. He nodded. "En, you have returned." As he said this, he seemed to have switched a book before he continued, "It's good that you have returned. Pack your things. Tomorrow you are going to Great Yue." "Going there? For what?" Her breath caught, her face deathly white as she fought to suppress the cries which threatened to escape her. The man did not seem aware of this. His voice remained unchanged as he said, "To exchange for Yue Sha." In an instant, Su Bai's entire body seemed to have been pushed beyond their very limits. Her limbs weakened. She collapsed onto the grounds. She knelt in front of his room, crying. Her cries were like a great iron hammer, driving steel nails into a person's heart. Yet the man within the room remained unmoved, and the person outside the room could only cry her heart out. I saw Yue, who had been standing next to me, slowly walk over. He bent down and extended a hand towards the young woman who was crying on the floor, stubbornly trying to wipe away the tears on her face. Yet he could not touch her, and could only repeat this action over and over, even as tears fell from his own eyes. Su Bai once told me that when she cried, her master would help her to wipe away her tears. He had said to her that when she was done crying, he would bring her home. When Su Bai had recounted this to me, her smile blossomed with blissfulness. Yet at that time, I could never imagine the image of the legendary Gu master, a man as unfeeling as he was callous, wiping away the tears of another. Now that I was finally witnessing this image, without reason, my heart sank. Yue patiently repeated that familiar movement time after time. Even though he was unable to touch her, he acted as though she could see him and murmured soothingly to her, "Abai, be good. When you are done crying, I will bring you home." These words had no effect on Su Bai. After all, she could not hear them. Still, we continued waiting, and at last, we saw Su Bai's tears subside. She continued to sit in the rain for a long while before she eventually stood up. By that time, the man within the room seemed to have retired for the night, for there was no longer any light from within. Su Bai stared at the room and smiled faintly. "Master, I know that I am nothing in your heart. I know that I am worth nothing to you." "But master," she said as knelt on the grounds once more, heavily kowtowing. "To Su Bai, master, you are my entire life." She fought back her tears and cleared her throat as she began to sing a song which originated from her homelands of Great Yue. She was not gifted with a melodic voice like Alai, but managed to sing an enchanting song which struck the hearts of all who heard it. She sang, "Carved into my bones is my unwavering longing for your love, did you know?" Su Bai left before daylight. Yue and I continued to follow her. After last night's events, a crack had appeared on Yue's mask of calm indifference. His gaze, filled with anguish, never once moved away from Su Bai's figure. He said to me that day, after she left, she never returned. Then, he said, I never truly intended to trade her for Yue Sha. I planned to send her over to draw out that old fox. Once I obtained the gu, I would execute him on the spot. But she did not trust me. Yuchi's breath hitched as he said, "She really thought I was going to send her to that man and fled." I did not speak, only listening to his words as my eyes followed Su Bai, who staggered ahead in front of us. I knew that before long, this memory would soon come to an end. Because not long after, we would both discover where Su Bai had gone, Su Bai walked for a little longer before she stopped in her steps. Arched tall before her was a magnificent wooden door. Su Bai stood in front of the door, her head held high even as her body trembled, as though she knew what horrors lay within. Finally, at the precise moment when Su Bai raised her hand to push open that door, the last vestiges of Yueqi's self-control crumbled as he dashed forward, his movements swift as an arrow, loudly shouting Su Bai's name. "Bai! Don't!" I did not understand Yueqi's sudden agitation and could only run into this great palace after the two of them. After I made my way in, I saw that Yueqi was standing next to Su Bai, his expression in agony as he tried desperately to stop Su Bai, but his attempts were in vain. Su Bai's face was a picture of unyielding resolution as she slowly walked towards the pond filled with 10,000 venomous goo. She stared at the 10,000 goo within the pond, her tears silently falling. But she smiled and slowly she whispered, "Master!" "No, don't." Yueqi stood next to her, frantically trying to grab onto her hands, even as he repeated these words. But Su Bai could not see him. This had happened a long time ago, and Su Bai's words were a mere soliloquy. "Master, you wanted me to become a good goo master, so I became a good goo master. You wanted me to abandon my past and devote myself to Southern Zhao, so I devoted myself to Southern Zhao. Now you want the Juesha goo." She bowed her head, staring at the 10,000 goo within the pit. A long pause, and finally she seemed to have steeled her heart. "I will give you Juesha. I will not go to Great Yue, but for you, I can create the best goo." "But master," she suddenly laughed, "don't you agree that my entire life is a tragedy? I also wish to lead a simple life, but now, other than this pit filled with 10,000 venomous creatures, I cannot think of a better home. My home was long destroyed, my country conquered. The person who loved me was murdered by me in my ignorance. The person I loved wanted to exchange me for a venomous creature. Master, you said that you would give me a home, but in the end, all that you have given me was a lifetime of sadness. But I do not hate you." She took a step forward, smiling sadly. "Even if you have never understood the value of a person's love, still, I wish to be with you for all eternity." Her last words having fallen, Su Bai abruptly jumped into the pond filled with 10,000 goo. Yueqi stood rooted in spot. He watched as Su Bai jumped, tears falling from his eyes. Yet I knew that this entire matter had not been concluded. I quickly took 2 urgent steps forward and clung onto the entirely distraught Yueqi as we swiftly jumped in after her. The instant we jumped, I immediately regretted my decision. I knew that this was a pond filled with venomous goo, but I also knew that in Su Bai's memories, Yueqi and I were mere spirits and could never be harmed. Yet as I stared at the dense pit swarming with snakes, scorpions, and other beasts, I could not help but shudder with fear. Even as a spirit, I was already frightened beyond words, so I could only imagine the agony endured by Su Bai, who had jumped into this venomous pit of goo with her flesh and blood body. With a body covered with injuries, she fought against the countless goo. I saw these venomous insects and serpents and scorpions gnaw and bite at her until her flesh began to strip away, revealing the grotesque white of her bones. Using the dagger which she had kept within her sleeves, she continued to fight, driving them away from her. Before long, her senses started to blur as her mind grew increasingly disoriented. She began to eat these venomous creatures and started to display some of the moves exhibited by these goo. This entire process was too bloody, and I could not bear to continue watching. Yet Yueqi watched of all these through unblinking eyes. His stare was unwavering as he took in all that had happened, his eyes filled with laughter, and within that laughter shone with tears. Amid all these, someone appeared to have arrived. The two of them did not take notice of this newcomer, and I was the only one who raised my head to glance at the person. It was Alai. Alai looked around the goo pond before she said with a cold smile, "So you've actually come here. Since you want to become the Juesha goo, then so be it. How can I not grant you your wish if you have such determination and courage?" Having said these words, Alai turned to leave. At that point, I found that I did not care. I did not know what Alai was planning, but I soon grew tired of watching the bloodbath within the goo pond and found a corner to rest. Between my days, I did not know how much time had passed, but when I woke up once more, I saw that all the goo had disappeared from within the pond. And Su Bai, other than the outline of a human figure, it was no longer possible to tell what she once looked like. She was curled up in a corner, as though enduring excruciating agony. Yet her dagger continued to slash away. Yue remained by her side. He raised his arms, slowly trying to pull her into his embrace. Carefully, I made my way across, only to see that Su Bai was using her dagger to carve onto the grounds the two words Yue over and over again. Dimly, I heard her whispers, "I must never forget, I will never forget." Misgivings filled my mind, but I soon heard Yue explain hoarsely, "A Gu vessel does not have any memories. She will soon forget all these." But Su Bai was not merely a Gu. She was unwilling to forget. She could not forget. So she continued to carve Yueqi's name onto the grounds and across the walls, over and over, to remind herself of their past. Yet those memories were soon corroded in face of the Gu poison. Even after she had imprinted his name over every inch of surface within the Gu pond, even after she had carved his name onto the white bones which were exposed beneath her flesh. When she finally awoke the next morning, she soon discovered that apart from this name, she was unable to remember anything else. She hugged her head and cried until she was breathless. Even though she did not know why she was crying, she continued to repeat that name over and over, Yueqi, Yueqi. These pleading cries seemed to be the last straw on the camel's back, landing heavily on Yueqi. Yueqi hugged her, and at last his unyielding self-control crumbled into smithereens as his indifference shattered, his cries joining hers. He buried his head in her collar, which he was unable to make contact with, his tears falling rapidly as he repeated her name in a raspy voice, "Su Bai, Su Bai." But she was unable to answer him. In between his hoarse shouts and devastating cries, Su Bai's last whisper of his name soon faded into a hiss similar to a snake's. She no longer had any tears. She no longer had any sadness. As the only person who remained clear-headed, I stood by the side, silently watching over them. Not long after, I heard the sound of the door opening from above. Ah Lai's clear and exquisite voice traveled from above as she said confidently, "Lord Yueqi, even if Su Bai fled in her fear and is unwilling to trade herself for the Juesha Gu, I still managed to find a way for you to concoct the Juesha. I found a person from the Central Plains who is extremely skilled in martial arts to become the sacrifice to the Gu. She is really formidable and managed to kill all the Gu within this pond to concentrate all the poisons into her one body. This is dark sorcery. You should not have done that." Yueqi's voice accompanied the echo of his footsteps. His voice carried a hint of displeasure. Ah Lai said in a wronged voice, "If you don't have Juesha, everyone will doubt your ability in mastering the Gu. I don't want anyone to question your skill." "Have you found Su Bai?" Yueqi abruptly changed the topic, as though he no longer wanted to argue with her. Ah Lai seemed to grow even more unhappy as she said darkly, "Lord Yueqi, why do you bother looking for such a traitor? Since she has chosen to flee, let her be." As they talked, the two of them drew closer, until they finally stopped next to the Gu pond. Yueqi bowed his head and silently observed Su Bai, who was curled within, and Su Bai lifted her head to meet his gaze. The scorching sunlight flittered through the doorway to illuminate the man's figure, yet in the eyes of the snake's spirit there was no longer any trace of nervousness, only two eyes filled with hazy confusion. In the end, Su Bai did not remember him, and Yueqi was unable to recognize Su Bai, who stood right before his eyes. Staring straight at Su Bai, whose face was beyond recognition, he vowed, "I will find her. Even if I have to use my entire life to do so, I will find her." I thought that this was really an extremely cruel joke pulled by the heavens. And this joke, as expected, caused the Yueqi who stood behind me to laugh. He began to laugh, staring helplessly as Su Bai was brought out of the Gu pond by the Yueqi of the memories. Then, he fell to his knees in front of the original Yueqi, listening as his past self declared, "Henceforth, you are my Gu, Jusha. You will never betray nor abandon me. Our lives are intertwined till death do us part." In the past, I had heard that when a Gu master created his most powerful Gu vessel, he would tie the fate of that Gu to his own life. From then on, if he lived, the Gu lived. If he died, the Gu died. Their destinies were forever linked. In the end, Yueqi and Su Bai reunited, but it was in such a cruel manner. In face of this absurdity, Yue, who finally understood the events which had happened 3 years ago, only continued to laugh. Even as he exhausted his voice and shredded his vocal cords, his laughter did not subside. I stood beside them for a long time until at last, Yue spat out a mouthful of blood and finally collapsed on the ground. Eventually, I brought the grief-stricken Yue out from that dream. After he awoke, he stared at the walls of my bamboo house in a daze. I sighed heavily and wanted to comfort him, but I found that I did not know what to say in face of his despair. And after his long moment of disorientation, Yue abruptly raised his head, a smile spreading across his lips. His smile was warm and soothing, yet it caused my heart to shiver unexpectedly. I saw Yue slowly stand up and walk out of the room before he stood in front of the young woman he had brought along with him. Gently, he asked, "What is your name?" That woman let out a hiss like a snake, and I did not know what she was saying. With a faint smile, Yue raised a hand to caress the woman's face, as though wiping away her tears. In a soft voice, he said, "As a descendant of the Su family, how can you cry so easily?" He pulled the young woman's hand into his own and continued, "Su Bai, come with me. I will give you a home." That woman could not speak and could only hiss, and it appeared as though he did not hear a thing, immersed in his own world as the two of them left together. His gentle smile, brimming with warmth, was reminiscent of the late autumn sun which shone in the skies the first time they had met in the city of Luoyang years ago. Then he had said to her, "Su Bai, come with me. I will give you a home." She raised her head to meet his eyes, her tears falling. From then on, this was the life she was destined to live. I sat upright, lifting my hand as I played the pipa. The melody which I wove was stuttering. I remembered 3 years ago, in a snowy night under a canopy of stars, a young lady who snatched my sweet potato. She asked me for a dream. I thought, today I have finally fulfilled her wish. I did not know why, but my eyes stung. Yet I smiled and continued to sing. Carved into my bones is my unwavering longing for your love, did you know? End.